Hey guys, in this video we're going to be doing Target 2C.2. Our mastery learning objective is being able to factor quadratics with positive numbers by identifying the factors in a Punnett square. Alright, so some things to remember, which I think we really need a refresher on there, is when we're multiplying positives and negatives, right, versus when we're adding positives and negatives. So if we are multiplying two positive values, our answer is going to be positive. If we are multiplying two negative values, right, two negatives, that's kind of dark, our answer then, when we're multiplying, switches back to positive. If we have a positive times a negative, the answer is negative. All right, so make sure you reference those in case you get stuck. When we are adding, slightly different. When we have two positive answers, our answer is positive. When we have two negative answers that we're adding together, that's still going to be negative, right? They're both negative. The other thing is when you have a positive and a negative. So when you have a positive number that is larger, so that's the thing. You have to make sure which one is bigger, right? Larger positive and a smaller negative is going to result in an answer that is positive. Right, so the larger positive outrules that negative and makes the whole answer positive, right? It's the difference between them. Versus when you have a smaller positive and a larger negative, then there's more negatives, so that makes our answer negative, okay? So make sure you keep those in mind, because when we are working with this, we are going to be working still with that same quadratic, our standard formula, right? So ax squared plus bx plus c. And I see I have the last number, right? So what I'm talking about is that this last number, this c, is what I'm talking about, the last number, right? So last number is whatever that c value is. So obviously we need to multiply to that number. And if it's positive, then our middle number, which is bx, right? That's going to be our middle number. If it also is positive, then what that means is that both numbers that we're going to use to factor that quadratic are positive. Right? If they multiply to a positive, then both, and our middle number is a positive, and that means both answers are going to be positive. If I have that last number that's a positive, but the middle number is a negative, right? So now it's a negative. What that means then is that both numbers are negative. Because, remember, looking up to the top, two negatives multiplied together gives us a positive, but when we add them, we need a negative. Alright, well, what happens if that last number is negative? Well, then, if my middle number is a positive, you have to pick the larger number and make that positive, and the smaller number has to be negative, because again, we want to add up to that middle term, and if it's a positive, that means that there's more positives than negatives. If we have a negative value for c, and that middle number is a negative, well, now we need more negatives, so the smaller number is going to be positive, and the larger number is going to be negative. Alright, so please reference back to this chart in case you ever get stuck when you're looking at these. And I'm going to scroll down a little bit to our first example here. Because now we're going to be dealing when you have a positive and a negative sign, so I'm going to leave that up there for us. So same kind of idea, starting off with our Punnett squares. We want to find out what we're multiplying to. I see I have a positive value that I'm multiplying to, so I am going to be looking at that last number being positive, right? And then my middle number, which I add to, is a negative. So when the last number is a positive, but the middle number is in the negative, that means then that both, right over here, both numbers are negative. So both negatives. Alright, So now I'm going to look for numbers that, on my Punnett square now. I know that x squared is going to go in the top left. I know that 16 is going to be in the bottom right. So I'm looking for numbers that multiply to 16, but add up to a 10. And both values are going to be negative. So we're looking at two numbers that multiply to 16, but add up to a negative 10. Both of them are going to be negative. So if you go back to that power, the factor, or the multiplication chart, which is right here. So I'm looking for where I see 16 on my multiplication chart. I see a 16 here. But 16 and 1, if I make those negatives, that would be a negative 17. So that one does not work. A 8 and 2. That works, because if I do a negative 8 minus 2, that gives me a negative 10. That's exactly what my middle term is, so I am going to be using 8 and 2, because both of them are negatives. So going back to my example here, I'm going to be using, right, negative 8 times a negative 2. That gave me a positive 16, which is what I needed. And a negative 8x minus 2x, those were both negative. So that gives me a negative 10x. So these are my two values that I'm going to be plugging into my Punnett square here. And I need to find the outsides of the Punnett square box. Well, x squared is x times x. X times a negative 8 is a negative 8x. X times a negative 2 is a negative 2x. And negative 2 times a negative 8 is a positive 16. So I do know I have my factors done correctly. I'm going to go ahead then and move my binomials down to the bottom. So x minus 8 times x minus 2. And I am done, and that is my answer. Looking at number 2. I have an x squared minus 7x minus 18. Well, now my last number is negative. So I'm going to be looking at that last column when the last number is negative. And that middle number that I add to is also a negative. So that means that I need the larger positive, a larger negative, and a smaller positive. So I'm going to say, oops, that keeps jumping like that. Sorry for making you busy. So smaller positive, and I'm going to say a larger negative. Alright, so I'm looking for negative 18. I multiply to 18, and I want to add to a 7. Now, going back to my factor chart, yes, you can go back. I think hopefully now we're getting a little bit better at finding out what those are. Numbers that multiply to 18 but would add to a 7 would be a negative 2 or a negative 9 and a positive 2, right? Those multiply to negative 18. And then if I were to combine these two together, a negative 9 plus a positive 2 is a negative 7x, which is what I needed because that was my middle term. So I'm going to go ahead and fill this out. My x squared goes in the top left. My negative 18 goes in the bottom right. And then I'm going to take this negative 9x, put it in my Punnett square. Take that positive 2 and put that in my Punnett square. And then find the outsides of my Punnett square. So this is going to be x times x gives me x squared. X times a negative 9 gives me a negative 9x. X times a positive 2 gives me a positive 2x. And negative 9 times a positive 2 is a negative 18. So my final answer then is going to be x minus 9 times the quantity of x plus 2. Alright, looking at the next example here, you probably have to flip over your packet. I see x squared plus x minus 1. So I know I'm going to be multiplying to a negative 12. So that is the number I'm going to be searching for on my factor chart. Right, negative 12 is the bottom right. I see that positive 2x, that's going to be in the top left. And I have to add to a positive 1x. Remember there is a positive 1 there. So numbers that multiply to negative 12 but add to 1, that is a negative 12, that is a positive 1. So I am going to be looking for a larger positive number. Large positive, small negative number, which would be 4 and 3, right? 4 times a negative 3 is a negative 12. 4x minus 3x is a positive 1x, which is still x, right? We don't really need that 1. So those are going to be the two values I'm going to be plugging into my Punnett square box, a positive 4x and a negative 3x. Please make sure that you write the negatives if it's a negative. Positive, you don't really need one, but you could also still write that plus 4 in case you want to. Finding the outsides of our binomials, x times x is x squared, x times a positive 4x. Positive 4 gives me a positive 4x. X times a negative 3 gives me a negative 3x. Negative 3 times positive 4 does give me my negative 12. So my answer here then is going to be x plus 4 times x minus 3. Again, these are called our factors. So in case I ever ask you to find your factors, that is what I need you to do. Next example, x squared minus 12x plus 27. I have my last term there. Alright, this is what I'm going to be multiplying to. This is what I looked for on my factor chart. And I'm adding again to a negative 12. So if I have a positive that I multiply, but I'm going to be adding up to a negative 12, what that means then is that both of them are going to be negative. I'm looking for two numbers, and I'm just going to put a negative sign in front of them. Right? Because both are negative. So look for numbers that multiply to a positive 27, but then if you put negative signs in front of them, it gives us a negative 12. Right? And those two values then would be negative 9 and a negative 3. Those multiply to a positive 27. If I were to add them together, negative x minus 3x is a negative 12x. Those are the two values I'm going to be placing inside my Punnett square box. And then I figure out what the outsides of those squares are. So x squared is x times x. X times a negative 9 gives me a negative 9x. X times a negative 3 gives me a negative 3x. And negative 3 times negative 9 is a positive 27. So my binomials then are x minus 9 times x minus 3. Alright, looking at our next example here. Example 5, x squared plus 3x, or 6x minus 7. So I have that plus there. And it's going to be what I multiply to. This is what I add to. So x squared goes in the top left. Negative 7 goes in the bottom right. If I'm multiplying to a negative, but adding to a positive, that means that I'm going to have a large positive, but a small negative. So numbers that multiply to 7, but add to 6. Well, 7 times a negative 1 would be a negative 7. And a positive 7x minus a 1x would be a positive 6x. So these two values are what I am placing inside my Punnett square box. I have to figure out what my factors are. So this is going to be x times x gives me x squared. X times a positive 7 gives me a positive 7x. X times a negative 1 gives me a negative 1x. And negative 1 times a positive 7 is a negative 7. So my factors, x plus 7 times x minus 1. Go ahead and move on to 6. I'm multiplying to 12. I'm adding to a negative 7. So if I'm multiplying to a positive number, but the number I am adding to is negative, that means then both of them have to be negative. Again, I'm just referencing that chart that was on that first part of our notes. So my Punnett square box, I know x squared is going to be up left. My positive 12 is the bottom right. Two numbers that multiply to 12, and then what add to a negative 7, both of them have to be negative. Right? So a negative 3 times a negative 4 is a positive 12. If I were to subtract these, negative 3 minus 4x negative 7x, right? We're combining them. They have the same sign, so we basically add them, keep that negative together. So negative 3x, negative 4x. Figure out the sides of our Punnett square box. So x times x times a negative 3 gives me negative 3x, x times a negative 4 gives me negative 4x. Negative 4 times a negative 3 is a positive 12. So our binomials, x minus 3 times x minus 4, those are our factors for that quadratic. Last two here, I have a negative that I'm multiplying to. So I would be looking for 36 on my multiplication chart. And then I need two numbers that add up to a negative 5. So if they're multiplying to negative but also adding to a negative, that means that my larger number is going to be negative. And my smaller number is going to be a positive, right? Because they have to be opposite signs if they're multiplying to give me a negative. So my Punnett square then, x squared, negative 36. Numbers that multiply to negative 36 but add to a 5 would be a negative 9 and a positive 4. Right, that gives me a negative 36. Negative 9x plus a positive 4x, they have different signs, so I subtract them to give me my negative 5x, which is exactly what I needed. So negative 9x and a positive 4x. Right, just taking those two terms and putting them in my empty spots. So x times x gives me x squared, x times a negative 9 gives me a negative 9x, x times a positive 4 gives me a positive 4x, and negative 9 times a positive 4 is a negative 36. So my factors then, x minus 9 times x plus 4. Alright, last example here. I'm going to be multiplying to a negative 21, and I'm going to be adding to a positive 4x. So if I'm multiplying to a negative, but I'm adding to a positive, that means they have to be opposite signs, right? Because they're multiplying to a negative. And then if they're adding to a positive, that means then my larger number has to be positive. Right? Because I'm adding to a positive, so I need more positives. And then the smaller number is going to be negative. So two numbers that multiply to 21 that add to 4. If I look at my multiplication chart, start messing around with those numbers, I start seeing that 7 times negative 3 is a negative 21. If I were to combine these together, 7 minus 3x is a positive 4x, which is what I needed. Filling out my chart here, well, I forgot to put my x squared there, and I forgot to put my negative 21. But these two factors are the two that I'm putting in those empty spots, right? Positive 7x and a negative 3x. Figure out the outside. So x squared is x times x. X times a positive 7 gives me a positive 7x. X times a negative 3. Don't forget that negative because it was a negative 3x inside our Punnett square box. As well as negative 3 times a positive 7 does check out to be a negative 21. So my binomials, my factors, right? X plus 7 times x minus 3 is my final answer. So you can go ahead and work on activity 2C.2. Good luck.